take a close look at her tiara.
Yeah.
That's one of Princess Diana's favorites. It's actually the one that she wore at her wedding.
There is a legendary set of royal jewels that Queen Camilla will never be allowed to wear. It's not because they are locked away, and it's not because they are lost to history. A deliberate, permanent command was issued behind palace doors. These crowns would never touch her head. Instead, they were quietly saved for another woman entirely, Catherine. Why did the palace make such a ruthless, calculated choice? Let's unmask the royal secret. The jewels that carry more than history.
Kate Middleton is channeling her late mother-in-law. The Princess of Wales took an item out of Princess Diana's collection on December 5th.
There is a version of the royal jewelry story that the palace tells publicly. It involves careful rotation of historic pieces across official engagements. It involves curators and conservators, and the dignified management of a collection spanning centuries. It involves gracious loans, thoughtful selections, and the kind of institutional stewardship that makes the British monarchy look like the responsible guardian of a national treasure. That version is true as far as it goes, but it does not go nearly far enough. Because inside that vast and glittering collection, there are pieces that carry a different kind of weight entirely. Pieces whose significance is not measured in carats or historical provenance, but in the human stories attached to them, the choices made about who wears them and who does not. The decisions that were never announced but were absolutely final, and the woman who was quietly, deliberately, and permanently excluded from some of the most significant pieces in the entire royal collection. To understand the full story, you have to understand what you are actually looking at when you look at the crown jewels and the private royal collection. These are not simply decorative objects, they are statements. Every time a senior royal appears in public wearing a specific piece, a message is being sent about status, about continuity, about who belongs and who is merely present. The women of the British royal family have understood this for generations, and the people managing that collection have understood it even longer. The pieces at the center of this story are not the most famous items in the collection. They are not the pieces that appear on currency or in coronation portraits. They are something more personal than that, more intimate, and for that reason, considerably more loaded. The first is the Girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara. It was given to the future Queen Mary as a wedding gift in 1893. Queen Mary later gave it to her granddaughter Elizabeth as a wedding present in 1947. Queen Elizabeth II wore it so frequently in the early decades of her reign that it became the defining image of her as a young monarch. It appeared on stamps. It appeared on banknotes. For an entire generation of British people, this tiara was not simply jewelry. It was the face of the Queen herself. When Elizabeth died in September 2022, the tiara passed with the rest of the private collection into the management of the new reign, and in 2024, it appeared in public again. Not on Camilla's head, on Catherine's. The second piece is the Lover's Knot tiara, and this one carries a weight that goes beyond historical significance into something deeply personal for the Wales family. Queen Mary commissioned it in 1914, inspired by a piece that had belonged to her grandmother, Princess Augusta Caroline. Queen Elizabeth II inherited it and wore it regularly throughout her reign. Then she loaned it to Diana, and Diana wore it so often and so beautifully and with such evident joy that the piece became inseparably associated with her in the public mind. After Diana's death in 1997, the tiara was put away. It was not worn publicly for years. Then William gave it to Catherine. And Catherine has worn it to some of the most significant official engagements of her royal life. These two pieces alone tell a story. But they are not the only ones. The Collingwood necklace, a set of historic brooches connected directly to Queen Victoria, several pieces from the Cambridge collection that passed to Elizabeth through her mother's family. All of these sit within a broader pattern that, when you examine it carefully, reveals something that the palace has never publicly stated, but has made absolutely clear through action. Camilla does not wear Diana's pieces. She does not wear the pieces most personally associated with the women of the direct Windsor line. She wears other things, beautiful things, historically significant things, but not those things. And the question that has never been fully answered in public is why. Was it a personal choice? Was it an instruction? Was it the result of a conversation or a decision made at the highest level of the household? And when exactly was that decision made, and by whom? The answer to those questions involves Queen Elizabeth. It involves William, and it involves a set of deliberate choices about what these jewels represent and who has the right to wear them. And it begins much earlier than most people realize, long before Catherine ever set foot inside the royal family, long before the question of what Camilla would or would not wear had even become relevant. It begins with a quiet, private, and entirely characteristic decision made by a queen who was watching everything and saying very little. Keep watching, because the next chapter is where the story gets genuinely significant. The ban nobody talked about publicly. The word ban is a strong one. It implies a formal decision, a written instruction, a moment where someone in authority sat down and said clearly that a specific thing would not be permitted. And in the world of royal jewelry management, nothing quite that explicit ever happens. The palace does not issue memos about which senior royals are prohibited from wearing which historic pieces. It does not hold press conferences about access restrictions. It does not announce these things at all. What it does instead is considerably more effective. It simply arranges things in a particular way and allows the arrangement to speak for itself. Pieces are made available to some people and quietly unavailable to others. Requests are fulfilled or not fulfilled without explanation. And over time, a pattern emerges that is as clear and as deliberate as any written instruction, even though no written instruction was ever issued. That is precisely how the restriction on Camilla's access to certain pieces operated. And understanding how it worked requires understanding something fundamental about how the royal collection is managed, and who, ultimately, has the final word on its use. During Queen Elizabeth II's lifetime, the answer to that question was simple. Elizabeth decided. The collection was hers. The pieces were hers. And while she managed them with the kind of institutional thoughtfulness that characterized everything she did, the final decision about who wore what and when rested entirely with her. No senior royal could simply reach into the collection and select a piece for an upcoming engagement. Access was managed, approved, and controlled from the top. That control gave Elizabeth something enormously powerful: the ability to make statements about people and relationships and institutional standing without ever saying a single public word. A piece loaned to one woman and withheld from another was a complete sentence in the language of royal communication. Anyone inside the family who understood how things worked could read it perfectly. Charles and Camilla married in April 2005. In the years that followed, Camilla's public profile developed steadily. She took on royal duties. She built a reputation for warmth and genuine commitment to her charitable work. She made, by almost any objective measure, a serious and sustained effort to earn her place inside the institution. And Elizabeth, to her credit, supported that effort publicly. She was seen with Camilla at official events. She extended to her the visible marks of inclusion that mattered enormously for Camilla's public positioning. But there were limits, and those limits were nowhere more visible than in the jewelry. Sources familiar with the management of the royal collection during Elizabeth's reign describe a clear and consistently maintained position regarding certain pieces. Pieces directly associated with Diana were simply never made available to Camilla. Not discussed, not considered, not offered. The lover's knot tiara sat in storage. The pieces most personally connected to Diana's time as Princess of Wales were managed in a way that kept them entirely outside the rotation available to Charles's new wife. This was not accidental. Sources are consistent on this point. The management of those pieces reflected a deliberate decision made at the highest level and maintained without exception throughout the remainder of Elizabeth's reign. Nobody in the household needed to be told explicitly. The pattern was clear enough, and the people responsible for the day-to-day management of the collection understood what was and was not available for Camilla's use without requiring written instructions. What makes this particularly significant is the timing. Elizabeth made this decision, sources suggest, very early, not in response to any specific incident or request, not as a reaction to something Camilla did or said or asked for, but proactively, as a quiet, private, permanent arrangement that protected certain pieces from a future that Elizabeth had already thought through more carefully than most people around her realized. She was thinking about Diana. She was thinking about William. And she was thinking about Catherine, even before Catherine and William's relationship had become serious enough to make that thinking anything other than theoretical. That level of foresight is, when you sit with it, genuinely extraordinary. Elizabeth was managing not just the present, but the future. She was arranging things in a way that would hold across the transition from her own reign to whatever came next. She was building protections into the collection's management that would outlast her ability to personally enforce them. And to a remarkable degree, it worked. Because the pattern she established during her lifetime became the foundation for the decisions that William made after her death. The pieces she had quietly kept from Camilla were the same pieces he directed toward Catherine. The protection she built informally during her reign became the formal arrangement of the next one. But here is the question that nobody has fully answered. How much of what Elizabeth did was about protecting Diana's memory specifically, and how much of it was about something deeper? Something connected to her own private assessment of Camilla's place inside the family? Something that went beyond jewelry and touched on the question of belonging itself? Because the more closely you examine the decisions Elizabeth made about the collection, the more clearly you can see the outline of a position she never stated publicly, but maintained with absolute consistency throughout the final 2 decades of her reign. And that position, and what it reveals about Elizabeth's true feelings about Charles's marriage, is exactly what we are examining next. Queen Elizabeth's hidden hand. Queen Elizabeth II was the most disciplined public figure of the 20th century, possibly of any century. She gave nothing away. In 70 years of public life, across thousands of official engagements, hundreds of state banquets, and decades of interactions with the most powerful people on the planet, she maintained a quality of personal opacity that was so consistent and so complete that it became its own kind of legend. You never knew what she was thinking. You never knew how she truly felt. You only knew what she chose to show you. Which is precisely why the things she did quietly, without announcement, without explanation, and without any apparent concern for whether anyone noticed, carry such extraordinary weight. Because when Elizabeth acted without speaking, she was communicating something she had decided was too important to leave to words. Words could be misquoted. Words could be taken out of context. Words could be denied. But actions, quiet and consistent and maintained over years, those told the truth in a way that nothing else could. Her management of the royal jewelry collection in the years following Charles and Camilla's marriage was one of those actions. And when you look at it carefully, what you see is a woman who had formed a very clear private view about what certain pieces represented and who they belonged to, a view she never stated publicly, a view she implemented through the quiet machinery of collection management, and a view that has shaped the jewelry story of the British royal family in ways that are still unfolding today. Elizabeth's feelings about Camilla are a subject of considerable complexity and considerable historical dispute. Publicly, she moved from a position of distance to one of visible acceptance with the kind of measured grace that characterized all of her most difficult navigations. She invited Camilla to official events. She was photographed with her warmly. She made the public gestures that signaled to the world that Charles's wife was an accepted member of the family. But sources who were close to the Queen during those years describe a private position that was considerably more nuanced than the public one. They describe a woman who accepted the reality of Charles and Camilla's marriage because the alternative was a rupture with her son that served nobody, who extended the visible marks of inclusion because the institution required it, but who maintained, in the private spaces where her real feelings lived, a set of reservations about Camilla that never fully resolved. Those reservations were most clearly expressed through the jewelry. In 2007, 2 years after Charles and Camilla's wedding, a specific request was made on Camilla's behalf regarding a piece from the royal collection for an upcoming state engagement. The piece requested was not one of the Diana pieces. It was a historically significant item, but not one carrying the personal emotional weight of the lover's knot or the girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara. The request was declined. A different piece was made available instead. This pattern repeated itself across the following years. Requests made, Different pieces offered. The specific items most closely associated with the direct female line of the Windsor family quietly, consistently, unavailable. Sources who were involved in the management of the collection during this period describe the process with careful discretion. But what emerges from their accounts is a picture of a system operating exactly as Elizabeth intended it to operate. Pieces were not refused dramatically. Nobody said no in a way that created a confrontation or generated a grievance that could be articulated and addressed. Things were simply arranged in a particular way. And that arrangement reflected the Queen's wishes absolutely. What is particularly revealing is what Elizabeth did during this same period with the pieces she was protecting. She did not simply put them in storage and leave them there. She thought carefully about their future. She spoke, according to sources close to her household, about specific pieces in connection with specific people. Not Camilla, not any of the other women then inside the royal family. William's future wife, whoever that would turn out to be. She had decided, apparently very early and with characteristic firmness, that the pieces most personally associated with the direct Windsor female line would pass to the woman William chose, not as a loan, not as a managed rotation through the collection's usual processes, but as a genuine, personal, emotionally significant transfer, a continuation of the line that ran from Queen Mary to Elizabeth herself, to Diana and onward. Camilla was not part of that line. In Elizabeth's private accounting, she never had been. The public acceptance was real. The institutional inclusion was genuine, but the jewelry told a different story. The jewelry said that certain things were not transferable through marriage to a divorced king, that certain pieces carried a form of belonging that was not conferred by a wedding ceremony or a royal title, but by something older and more fundamental than either. When Catherine joined the family, Elizabeth's behavior around the collection shifted in a way that sources describe as quietly but unmistakably significant. The pieces that had been carefully maintained outside the available rotation began to be discussed differently. Their future began to be considered in a more concrete and more personal way. And the woman being considered in connection with them was always the same woman. Catherine was not simply going to borrow these pieces for official engagements. She was going to receive them, in the same spirit in which Elizabeth herself had received the Girls of Great Britain and Ireland, tiara, from Queen Mary in 1947. As a direct, personal, generationally significant gift from one custodian to the next. That decision was made by Elizabeth long before she died. It was simply waiting for the right moment to become visible. And the person whose feelings about that decision shaped everything that came after was not Elizabeth. It was William. And what he felt about these pieces, and why, is the part of this story that makes everything else make complete sense. Diana's shadow over every stone. There is a photograph that many people who follow Diana's public life will remember without needing to be reminded of it. Diana, at a state banquet in the late 1980s, the lover's knot tiara on her head, her hair swept up, her posture perfect. Her expression, carrying that particular quality she had of looking simultaneously completely present and privately somewhere else entirely. It is one of the most reproduced images of her royal years. And it is impossible to look at it without understanding immediately why William felt the way he felt about that piece, and every piece like it. He was a child when his mother wore those jewels. He was a boy who watched his mother dress for official engagements and come home from them and exist day by day inside a marriage that was destroying her while the world watched her shine. The jewelry was part of all of that. The tiaras and the necklaces and the brooches were the outward face of a life that looked extraordinary from the outside and was, from the inside, something considerably more painful. When Diana died in August 1997, William was 15 years old. He was old enough to understand everything, old enough to have formed clear views about what had happened to his mother and why. Old enough to have identified, with the precision of a grieving and intelligent teenage boy, the specific people and the specific decisions and the specific institutional failures that had contributed to her suffering. He has never spoken about those views publicly in any direct or comprehensive way. He has been careful. He has been measured. He has conducted himself with a restraint around the subject of his mother's death and his father's marriage that has required, by every account of people close to him, an enormous ongoing act of emotional discipline. But the jewelry was never something he could be entirely rational about, because the jewelry connected directly to the clearest and most personal memories he had of his mother, not the public memories, not the official photographs, the private ones, the ones that belonged to him. Sources close to William describe a man who formed a very specific and very firm position about his mother's jewelry early in his adult life. Not all of it. The pieces that had been part of the general royal collection before Diana wore them were a different matter, but the pieces most personally associated with her, the pieces that existed in his memory as part of who she was and how she moved through the world, those pieces were, in his private understanding, not available for general use. They were not available for Camilla. That position did not require discussion or deliberation. It was simply part of how William understood the world and his place in it. And because Elizabeth shared a version of that understanding, the practical management of the collection during her reign reflected it without William ever needing to make a formal request or articulate a formal objection. But there was a positive dimension to William's feelings about the jewelry that went beyond the protective. It was not simply that he did not want certain pieces worn by certain people. It was that he had a very clear and very personal vision of what he did want to happen to them, and that vision centered entirely on Catherine. He had decided, according to people close to him, that the pieces most personally associated with Diana would go to the woman he married, not as a gesture toward the public narrative of Diana's legacy, not as a strategic piece of palace communications designed to generate favorable coverage, but as something private and genuine and deeply personal, a way of connecting the woman he loved to the mother he had lost, of creating a continuity that the circumstances of his family's history had otherwise made impossible. When he gave Catherine the lover's knot tiara to wear for the first time, it was not a casual decision made by a wardrobe team managing the rotation of available pieces for an upcoming engagement. It was a deliberate act, a considered, emotionally significant decision made by a man who had been thinking about this moment for a long time. He chose the occasion carefully. He chose the timing carefully. And Catherine, who understands William's relationship with his mother's memory better than almost anyone alive, wore the piece with the kind of quiet, respectful awareness that told everyone who understood the full story exactly what they were looking at. They were looking at William keeping a promise, not a promise he had ever stated publicly, not a promise anyone outside his closest circle knew about, but a promise he had made privately to himself about what his mother's things deserved and who deserved to have them. For Camilla, the shadow Diana cast over these pieces was not something that could be managed or navigated or addressed through any amount of time or goodwill or public acceptance. It was simply there, permanent and immovable, not because William was consumed by grief or unable to function around Camilla in normal circumstances. He has demonstrated repeatedly that he can, but because some things exist in a category that is beyond the reach of ordinary family diplomacy. His mother's jewelry was in that category. It always had been, and the people who imagined that time and institutional acceptance would eventually soften that position fundamentally misunderstood the nature of what they were dealing with. The question of how this all came together publicly, the moment when Catherine's receipt of these pieces moved from a private family arrangement to a visible institutional reality, is the piece of this story that crystallized everything, and it happened in a way that left absolutely no room for ambiguity about what it meant. The moment Catherine received them. There are moments in royal life that look, on the surface, like routine protocol. A senior royal appearing at an official engagement wearing a specific piece from the collection. A wardrobe choice noted by royal watchers and discussed briefly before the news cycle moves on. Something that comes and goes without generating the kind of sustained attention that its true significance deserves. The first time Catherine appeared publicly wearing the girls of Great Britain and Ireland, tiara was one of those moments. It happened in 2024. It was noted. It was photographed. It was discussed in the usual royal commentary circles. And then the conversation moved on. But for the people inside the palace, who understood the full history of that piece and the decisions that had governed its management for the previous 2 decades, what they saw that evening was not a routine wardrobe selection. It was the visible completion of an arrangement that Queen Elizabeth had put in place years before her death. A quiet, deliberate, entirely characteristic final move by a woman who had been thinking several steps ahead of everyone around her for the entirety of her 70-year reign. The transfer did not happen overnight. It was the culmination of a process developing across several years. Sources familiar with the process describe a series of conversations that took place between Elizabeth's household and William's office in the period between 2019 and 2022. Conversations about the long-term management of specific pieces, about which items should be formally transferred versus maintained as general collection loans, about the distinction between pieces that belonged to the institution and pieces that belonged, in a more personal sense, to the specific line of succession running through William and Catherine. Those conversations produced clear outcomes. Certain pieces were formally reclassified in the collection's management records. Their future use was designated in a way that reflected Elizabeth's wishes with the kind of institutional specificity that would survive her death and could not be subsequently altered by anyone else within the household. Camilla's name did not appear in connection with any of those reclassified pieces, not once, not in any capacity. The reclassification was complete and absolute, done while Elizabeth was still alive and fully capable of making her wishes known. This was Elizabeth's decision, made clearly, implemented formally, documented in a way that left no ambiguity. When Charles became king in September 2022, he did not attempt to revisit the arrangements Elizabeth had put in place. He did not reopen the question of Camilla's access to the restricted items. He honored his mother's arrangements completely. Camilla's access to the collection remained exactly what it had been during Elizabeth's lifetime, significant and substantial, but permanently bounded in the specific directions Elizabeth had decided. For Catherine, receiving these pieces was something she approached with considerable emotional weight. She understood what she was being given. She understood William's personal connection to the items most closely associated with Diana, and she wore them with the kind of thoughtful awareness that demonstrated she had internalized that history completely. The lover's knot tiara in particular. Catherine's first appearance in that piece was an occasion those close to William describe as genuinely moving for him. He had grown up seeing that tiara on his mother's head. He had watched it disappear from public view after 1997. And he had waited, through years of loss and complicated family history, for the moment when it would reappear in a context that felt right. It reappeared on Catherine, and it felt exactly right. Camilla was present at the engagement where Catherine wore the lover's knot for the first time. Sources describe her expression that evening as composed in the way that people are composed when they are working very hard at composure. She said nothing about the tiara. She made no comment that has been reported by anyone present. She simply existed in the same room as the piece that had never been made available to her and never would be. There is something in that image that tells the whole story more completely than any explanation could. A queen consort in the same room as a tiara she was never going to wear, and a princess of Wales wearing it as if it had always been hers. Because in every way that actually mattered, it had. What this means going forward, pull back from the specific pieces and the specific moments, and look at what the jewelry story actually reveals about the broader landscape of power inside the British royal family. Because what has unfolded across these decisions, from Elizabeth's quiet management of the collection during her lifetime to William's deliberate transfer of specific pieces to Catherine, is not simply a story about jewelry. It is a story about belonging, about legitimacy, about who the institution considers part of its direct line and who it considers adjacent to it. Camilla's position inside the royal family is, by any formal measure, a strong one. She is queen consort. She carries out official duties with genuine commitment. She has built a public profile that has, against considerable historical odds, developed real warmth and real respect. Nobody inside the palace is suggesting that her position is precarious in the formal sense. But the jewelry tells a different story about the informal sense. And in royal life, the informal sense is often the one that matters most. The pieces Camilla wears to official engagements are historically significant and genuinely impressive. But they are not Diana's pieces. They are not the pieces that Elizabeth wore in the photographs that defined her young reign. They are not the pieces that connect most directly to the emotional and personal core of the Windsor family's identity. Those pieces belong to Catherine now, and they will belong to her successors after her. The line that runs through them, from Queen Mary to Elizabeth to Diana to Catherine, does not include Camilla. It never did, and the decisions made across 2 reigns to manage the collection in a way that reflected that reality have now produced an outcome that is visible, documented, and permanent. For William, the jewelry transfers represent something that goes beyond institutional management or symbolic communication. They represent a form of fidelity to his mother that he has been able to express through action rather than words. He could not change what happened to Diana. He could not rewrite the history of her marriage or undo the suffering she experienced inside the institution he was born into. But he could decide what happened to the things she wore. He could ensure that they passed to the woman he chose and carried her memory forward in the way he believed it deserved to be carried. He did that, quietly, deliberately, and completely, in the most royal way imaginable. The crown jewels are photographed and cataloged and insured for vast sums, but their real value was never financial. It was always about what they said without words. Elizabeth knew that. William knows it. And every time Catherine wears Diana's tiara, the message is delivered perfectly. Some things were always hers.